My name is Alan Holland. I was born December 15th, 1944. I was born in Hinesville, Arkansas.
And this interview is for the Farmington Oral History Project, and we want to be sure that we have your permission to reuse the interview.
You have my permission.
Thank you, Alan. Who are your parents?
My parents were Mr. Horace Holland and Mrs. Hazel Holland.
And tell me about growing up as a child. Where did you live, and who were your siblings?
We lived outside of Hinesville, Arkansas, about 2 miles and about 7 miles west of Huntsville. I had two sisters. I was the middle child. I had an older sister named Jeannie Holland and a younger sister named Robin Holland.
Okay, tell me about your family's business.
Well, my dad started out in the old days, everybody farmed. And he was actually the first person in our family to get a job. When they started paving what is now 412, it was Highway 68 in the old days. When they started paving that highway, he got a job with the highway department. He actually went down there to sell them some milk. He milked a couple of cows, and he went down to sell the workers some milk at lunch, and they hired him. And from there, he also raised chickens, cows, and pigs on the farm, and he went to work for the Arkansas Livestock Sanitary Commission as a hog inspector. Wound up his career as USDA egg inspector.
Okay. What jobs did you work growing up?
Oh my! I worked in the hay fields as a youngster. They taught me how to drive a tractor when I was 12 for 50 cents an hour. I raked hay, hauled hay, picked anything that they grew, strawberries, cucumbers, so on. In the summertime, I worked for the Youth Corps. If you're ever out at Withrow Springs, some of the rock work there, I actually did that when I was, I think, a sophomore in college the summer year, my summer break. And I worked at Purina Honeysuckle Turkey Plant, and I worked at George's Egg House, and I had all kinds of experiences that I didn't want to repeat.
So tell me about your earliest memories of Farmington. How did you end up in Farmington?
I ended up in Farmington because, I don't know if because we played Farmington a couple of years that I was at Mountainburg, or that I played golf with the superintendent, George Ledbetter, in the summertime out at Razorback. But he called me up one day and said both of his coaches had left, and he wanted me to come up and talk about it. So we had an interview in the cafeteria with the cafeteria lunch, and he hired me to coach football at Farmington, and that would be for the school year 1969, 1970.
Tell me about your first team.
Well, the first team was somewhat, it was interesting in that the kids were not used to hard work, and they weren't used to coming to practice on a regular basis. They weren't used to discipline. And it was kind of touch and go, and I always look back to the first team I had, the very first game against Prairie Grove, as a turning point, because I think had we lost that game, I think about half the team was prepared to quit. And as it was, we were at Prairie Grove, we were behind, but we won the game because Prairie Grove got tired in the fourth quarter. We had a couple of them cramp up, a couple of them throw up, and I stressed that to my players, and they got fired up and won the game in the fourth quarter.
Talk about conditioning, that first summer practices that you had with those two-a-days with the team. Talk about those.
Well, I didn't believe in two-a-days, but the community and everybody felt since everybody else was having two-a-days, you should. We tried to get everything done in one practice because young people don't have a very long attention span, especially in hot weather when you're out there working. So we tried to get in all of our conditioning early in the morning and our pad work, and then when we came back in the afternoon, we didn't do any conditioning at all. We were in shorts, and we worked on our specialties, punt, kick, and so on, that sort of thing. Because they can't concentrate when they're hot, sweating in a helmet and full pads.
Let's talk about some of your players from that first year's team. Who were some of the leaders of the team, and what did you try to teach them for that first season?
The first season I was at Farmington, Our average backfield was like 135 pounds. Jackie Hill and Bobby Neal were the running backs, and Donnie Smith was the quarterback. I think Terry Swift was an end. We were very small, very slow, but after they got over the idea that hard work didn't kill them and it actually paid off, everything worked out.
Talk about that first season. How did it go?
Well, we wound up having a winning season. I believe we were 6-4, and I don't remember much else about it. The very first season.
Well, kind of take me through the best you can remember your different years there and how you built up from that first season of the teams that didn't want to practice to your state championship teams.
Well, I guess the catalyst was the first year they had playoffs. They hadn't had them very long, and Farmington could never seem to beat Gentry. Gentry was the nemesis, and Gentry was in the playoffs, and they were hosting Danville, and Danville was the king in those days. And Danville just stomped Gentry at Gentry. It was 66-6 or something like that. And I watched Danville, and they were so well coached and so disciplined, and their execution was flawless. And I came back and told my kids that that's what we were going to start doing. So I guess I was motivated by the first round of the playoffs. And sure enough, the very next year we wound up playing Danville in the first round of the playoffs. So I'd have to say the playoffs was a motivational factor for me.
What about the next year? Or let me back up. How did that first game go against Danville?
Well, in those days, they only took the winners of each conference. And then the team with the best record got a bye. So we actually got a bye, and we got to go watch Danville play Murfreesboro. And I told my kids not to go because I didn't want them to see Danville in action. And of course, they showed up. Their parents drove them down, and frankly, I was scared to death of Danville. But the kids, after watching them play, were not. They actually were calm, cool, and collected, and they just went out and executed, and we played very conservative. In fact, my good friend Jack Harder, who was a dentist in Fayetteville and a longtime Razorback supporter, came by at halftime, and he whispered in my ear, he said, "Don't forget the fullback." The fullback was Randall Lewis, and his little brother was Ricky Lewis, and they were our running game. And we managed to beat Danville. And that was the toughest game because they were the best team in the playoffs.
Did y'all win that year?
Yes. The next game was I'm having a senior moment.
But you went ahead to win?
Well, I'm trying to remember. We played Hazen. No, Magnet Cove. Magnet Cove at Russellville. We beat Magnet Cove at Russellville to win our first state championship and wind up 11-1. We lost our first game of the year to Prairie Grove at home. It was a non-conference game. But one of my best players broke his leg right in front of the bench in that game. And we had to wait like 30 minutes for an ambulance. They didn't have an on-site ambulance in those days. And our team was devastated. We just couldn't come back, and I think it still wound up like it was 13-6 or something, but we lost one. And then the next year, in 1973, we were 12-0. But probably going back to 72, the key game was Gentry because Farmington had never beaten Gentry. And it's a mental thing, mental block. We knew we were better than they were, but the kids could not get over that hurdle. We had a real struggle to beat Gentry and even get to the playoffs. If we hadn't gotten to the playoffs, obviously we wouldn't won the state championship.
Let's talk about some of the players on those teams. Who were some of your leaders and some of the players that helped inspire the their teammates?
Well, I mentioned Ricky Joe Lewis in 1972 was our leading rusher, and I think he still holds the record at Farmington for like over 1,700 yards rushing, and he was 5'3", 130 pounds. His brother Randall blocked for him at fullback. We had a relatively inexperienced offensive line that year, but then the next year, all the backs graduated and the line was experienced. Keith Mars and Tim Thomas and James Murphy, Eddie Walker. We had a good line. And we, of course, the first round we had to play Danville again in 1973. Played them at Ozark. And they switched their offense on us to one we had never seen in the second half, and so it became a shootout. We had to outscore them. It was a blow, I think, in the 30s. And if we hadn't beat them that year, of course, we wouldn't have won the state championship either. And we beat Hazen in 1973 for the state championship.
Who were some of your top rivals? You mentioned Gentry. Who were some of your other rivals? Was that your main rival?
No, the main rival was Prairie Grove. Prairie Grove was the first game of the year. It was non-conference for a long time. It's what we called our money game because we could make enough money to pay all our expenses and whoever had the home game that year. And it was usually a very tough rivalry. Usually the home team won. I used to call it the coach's contract game. You'd beat Prairie Grove, get to keep your job. Later on, we developed a rivalry with Huntsville, but it wasn't that long of a rivalry because we didn't move up and play them in their conference for a long time. It was just the last few years that I coached, we played in Huntsville.
How many years did you coach at Farmington?
I coached at Farmington 20 years or 21 years, exactly, I can't remember.
What were some of the most memorable games besides, I know the playoff games were, but what are some of the other games that stick out in your memory?
Well, I mentioned the Prairie Grove game, the very first game I was at Farmington. I think it was pivotal. And then later on, to give you some idea how difficult it is to win a state championship, later on, we had 4 teams reach 12-0 and reach the semifinals of the state playoffs and couldn't get past the hurdle. And those games go down as, well, I don't know, they were very depressing and historical at the same time. The loss at Barton, which we felt like we had some really bad calls. Barton had the state record for the longest winning streak and so on and so on. And we lost by a point at Barton. And we lost on a last-second field goal to Boonville down at Van Buren, sophomore kicker from the right hash mark. We thought we were going to go into overtime in that one. And then up here at Farmington in the mud in 1982, we lost to Hazen 12-8, and it rained the entire week and the entire night. The field was unplayable, and that's one of the few years that we had a wide open passing attack. I think the weather just did not like us. That was the year in Arkansas. It rained the entire next week also, and after that, they decided to move the playoffs to Little Rock on the turf because everybody had to play in the mud the next week also. It was not a true state championship game because of the weather.
Talk about how the playoffs have changed since then.
As I said before, when they first started the playoffs, only the winners got to go, the winners of each conference, so it was very quick, 3 games. And then they decided to add the winner and the runner-up, which is fine. That gave a little bit bigger field. But when they went to the 4-team format, I feel like the playoffs last way too long. And they're actually, I don't know, some people revel at the fact they just get to go to the playoffs regardless of their record and they get beat in the first round. But I think it's difficult because, first of all, in the playoffs, everybody is a loser but one. No matter how great a season you had, you lose your last game unless you win it all. And there's only one team going to do that.
Let's talk about the community of Farmington, how they responded to those championship years and your success at Farmington.
All coaches have an old saying: the more games you win, the more people you see at the game. And towards the end of the season, people start showing up that have never even come to a game if you're winning. So, but the people were very supportive. Needless to say, they become they become a lot more expert as you win more games. I know one of my players commented to me one time that he enjoyed football a lot more than basketball because his daddy didn't play football. And his daddy wasn't an expert and couldn't chew him out after the game. But basically, they were supportive. The only time I guess I ever got accused of coaching is when we lost. Otherwise, as they put it, the boys played good.
What changes, I mean, what was your trick to coaching, or what was the key to success? I mean, I know it's no trick, but what was the key to success at Farmington?
Well, coaching anywhere. I feel like the key to success is to outwork the other people. At Farmington High School, we had one of the first off-season programs of anybody. When we started lifting weights in the off-season and running agility drills, the superintendent actually got some irate phone calls from parents. They want to know why we were working the boys when it wasn't in season. So rather than just sit in the bleachers and play volleyball, we worked. And I feel like we got quicker and stronger. And then, of course, discipline and conditioning. All a coach can do is try to eliminate the reasons for losing. You don't want to lose a game because you're out of shape. You don't want to lose a game because you get a 15-yard penalty for fighting or something like that. And then the kids have to buy into it. I learned a lot of things in my brief playing career at Huntsville, what not to do. Because at Huntsville, when I was playing, we didn't think we could win, and therefore we didn't. And my goal at Farmington was to teach the kids that they could win, try to make them believe they could win. You come down to which came first, the chicken or the egg. How do you get confidence? You get confidence by winning. It's tough. And of course, you can't win without talent. You can't win without coaching. I've seen good coaches win with poor talent. I've seen poor coaches win with good talent. I've seen coaches mess up good talent. They have players that are really good, but they have no discipline. So it's a fine balance.
What do you remember about the town when you came here? What was Farmington like?
There wasn't much to Farmington. There was the Cardinal Diner. When I came to Farmington, there wasn't much, but the Cardinal Diner and Roland Davis's grocery store. And they could put in, make you a really good bologna sandwich at Roland's store. And they had a laundromat. And 2-lane road. The football field was surrounded by apple orchards, and across the road was grazing cattle, and there was hardly anything here in Farmington at that time.
What did you do for fun?
For fun, in those days I was really too poor to have a whole lot of fun, but we did play a little golf on the weekends at Razorback. That was the only golf course around that I could afford. And of course, I've always been an avid fisherman. I've fished a lot of lakes and pursued a lot of species.
What about playing golf or driving some balls here in Farmington? Didn't you say you used to do that for fun sometimes?
There was a time when I would go out on the practice field, which was right on the highway south of the old gym, and hit golf balls. And a couple of my players, Ronnie Hudson for one, would go across the road with their baseball gloves and field them for me. And at that time, Ronnie also, he and his brothers helped me mow the football field, which fortunately you only had to mow a couple times a year because you couldn't water it or fertilize it. But we mowed the football field with push Yazoo mower. He brought his mower up, and we had one at the school, so we had 2 mowers to mow the football field. And we were so poor, Farmington School was so poor, The superintendent, George Ledbetter, bless his heart, he did really, really good for the school, but he wouldn't buy lime to put lines down on the field. Instead, we used commodity flour. So if we had a light rain, our lines were rising.
Tell me about some of the people that were your biggest supporters, some of the people in the community that you could always count on to come out to the games and lend their support, win or lose.
One of the biggest supporters or best boosters of Farmington High School was Buddy Elkins. He was our postmaster. He's passed away, but you could count on Buddy for anything, to help build goalposts, to help build bleachers, paint, anything you needed. Anytime we needed anything over at the shop, Roy Hummel was always there. He was our agri teacher. And can't turn that off, I don't guess. I'm having trouble here.
Oh, tell me about some of your players. I know you had a lot of players over the years, but who are some of the ones that stand out of really the hard workers, or just, I know you've mentioned some earlier, some of your...
Well, at Farmington High School, we didn't have a lot of scholarship football players go on to college, but Buddy Conduff comes to mind. He played fullback here and linebacker, and he went on and had a 4-year career at Arkansas Tech. Brent Jackson was one of our linebackers, had a 4-year career at Ouachita Baptist. My son, Jay Holland, went down to Henderson State for 4 years. Bill Cooper went to Abilene Christian. Bill Cooper played on the state championship team in 1973. Brent Jackson and Jay and Buddy were all on those 12-1 teams that got to the semifinals. And we had a lot of unknown players that didn't go on, but they epitomized Farmington football, the 5'5", 150-pound kids that were just tough. Mike Kilpatrick comes to mind. He was a nose guard, and he'd lost an eye in a hunting accident. He only had one eye, and I was really scared to let him play, but he wanted to play. And the side of his helmet that had the eye was, the face mask was always bent up because he always led with that eye.
You talked earlier about your rivalry with Prairie Grove, and I'm sure the kids kind of knew each other. Talk about that rivalry over the years. Who were their coaches and some of their players?
Of course, the Farmington and Prairie Grove kids were familiar with each other. They hauled hay and worked together and lived sometimes in each other's backyard. In the early days, Farmington rotated a lot of coaches, not Farmington, Prairie Grove rotated a lot of coaches because they had a very active booster club. I used to say it was very difficult for a coach to stay over 2 or 3 years at Prairie Grove, and that's why Coach Danny Absher has done such an outstanding job. He's been there forever. And you notice when they kept a coach for a while, it solidified the program. I remember Kenny Ramey being at Prairie Grove. They were always tough when Kenny was there. And Vol Eads was there. And I can't really remember a whole lot of the other ones. I should have.
What was your overall record at Farmington? Or do you remember?
I could have brought that with me.
Let's see.
It was 100 and, I don't know.
What about the superintendents? What different superintendents did you work for?
My first superintendent at Farmington was George Ledbetter, and he was interested in keeping the school running, keep the buses running and the kids fed. And I worked for Merle Massey, Randall Lynch, Gilbert Bisher. I believe that's the list of superintendents at Farmington.
One of the traditions, this is not talking about football now, but talking about the community, Farmington doesn't have like a festival or an annual event, but one event that everyone or a lot of people go to here is their annual Fireman's Pancake Breakfast. Did you ever attend that?
I attended the pancake breakfast at Farmington years ago. I don't anymore.
What are some of the things you did in Farmington socially? I mean, for entertainment or for fun?
Farmington was, and probably still is, mostly a bedroom community. That's why there really wasn't any identity, I guess, because it was right between Prairie Grove and right outside of Fayetteville, and everybody went to Fayetteville to do whatever they were going to do.
Um, what are some of the biggest changes you've noticed in the community? I mean, obviously there's been the growth, but what are some?
Stoplight, some of the biggest changes was the number of stoplights, the 4-lane road, and the traffic, and all the new businesses coming in. I understand we're fixing to get a Taco Bell now, so we're going to be right uptown. It's basically just the influx of people.
If someone had never been to Farmington before and said, "Tell me about living in Farmington," what would you tell them?
Well, there must be some good things about Farmington because everybody wants to move here. They want their kids to go to school. Farmington has a really good school, has always had a reputation for that. The facilities are fixing to be state of the art. They're working on them. They do have a new gymnasium that is state of the art, and it's you don't have to worry about crime. I mean, we have a good police department. It's just a nice, safe place to live.
If someone ask you, "Alan, what's your favorite thing about Farmington?" what would you tell them?
I guess my favorite thing about Farmington would be location. You're right in the shadows of the goalposts of the Razorback Stadium and all the entertainment and anything you want in Fayetteville. And you're also close to Oklahoma if you want to go fishing.